10, 1940. 5:35 a.m. The Ardennes Forest, Belgian border, a German general named Erwin Rommel, commanding a tank division he'd taken over just 3 months earlier despite having zero prior experience with armor, rolled into Belgium at the head of roughly 218 tanks. He was 48 years old, largely unknown outside the army, and about to become one of the most famous commanders of the Second World War in less than 6 weeks. What Rommel's 7th Panzer Division did over the following 46 days is one of the fastest, most complete military collapses of a major European power in modern history. And understanding exactly how it happened is the only way to understand why, 2 years later in the Egyptian desert, the same German army would run into a British division it genuinely could not beat, one nicknamed after a small desert rodent. By May 13, Rommel's division had crossed the Meuse River under heavy fire. By May 21, it had reached Arras, where it survived a British counterattack only by turning anti-aircraft guns horizontally to blast tanks at point-blank range, a tactic born entirely out of desperation that became legend. By June 10, it reached the English Channel. By June 19, the fortress port of Cherbourg surrendered directly to Rommel. On June 25, 1940, when the armistice took effect, his division was 200 miles from the Spanish border. The French had a name for what they were fighting, because French intelligence genuinely could not track where the division was from hour to hour. They called it La Division Fantôme, the Ghost Division. It moved so fast, from terrain, the French High Command considered too dense for a rapid armored advance, that reports of it kept multiplying and contradicting each other, as if there were 3 or 4 German divisions instead of one. There weren't, but there was just one division, moving faster than anyone believed a division could move, commanded by a man who led from the front of a tank rather than a headquarters map table miles behind the line. By the time the guns went quiet, Germany had taken 1.9 million prisoners and knocked France, Belgium, and the Netherlands out of the war in under 7 weeks. A campaign so lopsided that military historians still study it as one of the most complete operational victories of the industrial age. Before I tell you what happened when this exact same commander met a different British force 2 years later in the desert, I want to ask something, because this channel only works if the people watching it are actually invested in getting the story right. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and whether anyone in your family served in it. History like this isn't abstract for a lot of you. It's a grandfather's unit patch, a photo in a drawer, a name on a war memorial. I'd genuinely like to know who's on the other side of this video. Now, back to Rommel. 9 months after France fell, in February 1941, Adolf Hitler sent Rommel to North Africa to rescue a collapsing Italian position in Libya. He arrived expecting, reasonably, that whatever British force stood in his way would break the way the French army had broken, fast and completely. The German High Command had every reason to believe this. Rommel's own service record said it should be true. The math of 6 weeks against 7 million Frenchmen said it should be true. Waiting for him in the desert was a British division that had been quietly building a completely different kind of fighting reputation since 1938. One forged not in 6 weeks of Blitzkrieg, but in nearly 2 years of grinding, mobile desert warfare against the Italians first, and then against Rommel himself. Its shoulder patch showed a small, sand-colored jumping rodent called a jerboa. Its men called themselves, and were known throughout the British Army as the Desert Rats. Rommel would go on to call the man who eventually broke his army at El Alamein a very daring and skillful opponent. But it wasn't one commander who stopped the Ghost Division's momentum in the desert. It was an entire division that had learned, through 18 brutal months of retreat, siege and counterattack, exactly how to fight the very tactics that had flattened France in under 2 months. What the German army encountered at El Alamein in the autumn of 1942 wasn't a fluke, and it wasn't a lesser version of what happened at Dunkirk or Sedan. It was the direct, hard-earned answer to Blitzkrieg, and it came from soldiers who'd spent 2 years in the sand, figuring out exactly what Rommel's Ghost Division had never had to face in France. An enemy that refused to keep retreating. December 9, 1940. The Western Desert, Egypt, Nearly 2 years before Rommel ever set foot in North Africa, the division that would eventually stop him was already at work, and its first opponent wasn't German at all. It was the Italian 10th Army, which had pushed into Egypt that September, with roughly 150,000 men against a British force barely a third that size. The division, then still carrying its earlier name, built and trained since 1938 by an unconventional tank theorist named Major General Percy Hobart, launched Operation Compass on December 9, 1940. What followed was one of the most lopsided victories of the entire war. Over the next 2 months, this small, mobile British force chased the Italian 10th Army more than 500 miles across the desert, culminating at the Battle of Baie de Fomme in February 1941, where it cut off and destroyed what remained of the Italian force entirely. The final count. Roughly 130,000 Italian prisoners taken, for a fraction of that in British casualties. That victory is where the nickname the world would come to know actually solidified. The division's shoulder patch, a small sand-colored desert jerboa, sketched after a commander's wife visited Cairo Zoo, had already given the men their identity. After Baie de Fomme, desert rats wasn't a joke anymore. It was a reputation. Then, in February 1941, everything got harder. Erwin Rommel arrived in Libya with the first elements of what would become the Afrika Korps, sent by Hitler specifically because the Italians had just been humiliated by this British division. And here's the part a lot of retellings skip past, because it complicates the clean story. The desert rats did not simply roll over Rommel the way they'd rolled over the Italians. Far from it. In June 1941, during Operation Battleaxe, British armour attacked German positions expecting a repeat of Baie de Fomme. Instead, Rommel's forces used 88mm anti-aircraft guns, repurposed as flat-trajectory anti-tank weapons, for a tactic the same 7th Panzer Division had improvised at Arras a year earlier, to devastate British tanks at long range before they could close the distance. The attack failed. Rommel followed it with Operation Crusader that November, a brutal seesawing month of combat that eventually relieved the besieged garrison at Tobruk, but at enormous cost to both sides. Then came Gazala, in May and June of 1942. Arguably the low point of the entire relationship between the Desert Rats and the Afrika Korps. Rommel outmaneuvered 8th Army badly. British forces were pushed back nearly 300 miles in a matter of weeks, all the way into Egypt itself, and Tobruk, the same fortress the Desert Rats had helped relieve 6 months earlier, fell to the Germans on June 21, 1942, with over 30,000 Allied troops taken prisoner in a single day. By early July 1942, Rommel's forces stood at a stretch of desert barely 60 miles from Alexandria, at a railway stop called El Alamein. On paper, the same pattern that had ended France in 6 weeks looked like it was about to repeat itself in Egypt. It didn't. Squeezed against the Qattara Depression, a stretch of impassable salt marsh to the south that finally denied Rommel the open flank his tactics depended on. The British line held. Through July 1942, in what's now called the First Battle of El Alamein, the Desert Rats and the rest of 8th Army fought Rommel's exhausted, overextended forces to a standstill. It wasn't a clean, decisive win. It was closer to both sides collapsing from exhaustion at roughly the same moment. But for the first time since Rommel had arrived in Africa, his advance simply stopped, and it did not start again. Winston Churchill would later put it in a single line that's been quoted ever since. Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat. What that line skips over is the 18 months of hard, uneven, often losing combat it took to get there. The Desert Rats weren't feared at El Alamein because they were undefeated. They were feared because they had already been beaten by this exact German army, in this exact desert, for multiple times, and kept coming back better prepared for what Rommel would try next. By August 1942, a new commander named Bernard Montgomery took over 8th Army, and the division that had chased Italians, been mauled at Gazala, and helped stop Rommel cold at the Qattara line, began retraining, re-equipping, and preparing for the battle that would finally answer, for good, whether Rommel's tactics still worked against an enemy that had spent 2 years studying them. October 23, 1942, 9:40 p.m. El Alamein, Egypt. Erwin Rommel wasn't even in the country when the battle that would end his campaign in Africa began. He was recovering from illness in Austria, having handed temporary command to General Georg Stumm. That night, 8 and 82 Allied artillery guns opened fire simultaneously along the line, and 4 infantry divisions began advancing through a minefield the British had nicknamed the Devil's Garden, with engineers clearing lanes for 500 tanks to follow behind them. Further south, the 7th Armoured Division launched a diversionary attack meant to pull German attention away from the main assault. Within hours, the man who had been running the Axis defence was dead. General Stumm suffered a heart attack after his vehicle came under fire while conducting a reconnaissance near the British lines. The first critical day and a half of the most important battle of the North African campaign, German forces had no senior commander at all. Rommel, informed of the crisis, flew back and resumed command on October 25. But the 2 days of confusion at the top had already cost the defence any chance of a clean, coordinated response. What followed over the next 10 days wasn't a single dramatic breakthrough. It was closer to what military historians call a battle of attrition, grinding, methodical, and expensive for both sides, but only sustainable for one of them. Rommel's Panzerarmee Africa had gone into the battle already outnumbered, roughly 116,000 men and 547 tanks against 8th Army's 195,000 men and over 1,000 tanks. And Rommel had something worse than a numbers disadvantage. He was almost out of fuel. On October 26, an Axis oil tanker carrying what remained of his last real hope for resupply was sunk before it reached port. Rommel told his own generals afterward that the loss meant there was no longer enough fuel left to conduct an orderly disengagement, even if he wanted one. He was, in the most literal military sense, stuck. By November 1, the imbalance had become stark. Axis forces had no more than 90 operational tanks left in the field. The Allies had roughly 800. On November 3, Rommel sent a message to Hitler stating plainly that his army could not continue fighting without more fuel and ammunition. British intelligence intercepted it. Hitler's response, arriving the same day, was a direct order to stand fast, to hold the line to the last man rather than retreat. Rommel initially obeyed it. By the next morning, November 4, it no longer mattered. The 5th Indian Brigade tore a wedge through the collapsing Axis front, and the 1st and 7th Armoured Divisions, the desert rats among them, poured through the gap along with the 2nd New Zealand Division, now free to roam and strike the German rear at will. Hitler reversed himself and authorized a withdrawal, but Rommel had already begun pulling back on his own authority. By November 5, what remained of the Panzerarmee Africa had retreated to Foucault, and the battle was effectively over. Final numbers tell you almost everything about why this defeat was different from anything the German army had experienced in France 2 years earlier. 8th Army suffered around 13,500 casualties. Axis losses ran as high as 30,000 killed, wounded and captured, along with virtually the entire remaining Axis tank force in Africa. In Britain, church bells rang out to mark the victory, the first time they'd been rung since the fall of France in May 1940. Winston Churchill called it plainly a decisive victory, and he was right in a way that went beyond one battle. North Africa would never again come close to falling to Axis forces after El Alamein. For here is the answer the title of this video promised. The same German army that dismantled France in 46 days through speed, audacity, and an enemy caught structurally unprepared to respond, for it met something completely different at El Alamein, a British force that had spent 18 months absorbing exactly those tactics, losing to them repeatedly, and adapting anyway. The desert rats weren't feared because they were unbeatable. They'd been battered at Gazala and humiliated at Tobruk just months earlier. They were feared because they kept coming back to the same fight better than before, on ground, the narrow corridor between the sea and the Qattara Depression that finally denied Rommel the open flank his entire method of war depended on. Rommel built his reputation on movement. At El Alamein, for the first time, the German army ran out of room to move and ran out of fuel to try. What was left standing in front of him, refusing to give ground, wearing a small jerboa on its shoulder, was the reason. If you want the next one of these, real dates, real units, no recycled internet mythology. You know what to do. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in it.